my net worth was probably over £4 million. I lost everything. I'd lost all my possessions. I'd got divorced, and what was left, I'd left to my ex-wife. I was sharing cells with guys who had murdered people with Mac 10 machine guns. I spent quite a bit of time in the same prison as the Hatton Garden guys, actually, for a while.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston. So, welcome to the second part of my interview with Tom Hayes, originally convicted of market manipulation in the LIbor case. Supreme Court, however, recently saying that was an unsafe, a wrong judgment against him. First part, we focused to a large extent on the madness of the market world in which he traded and the events leading up to his imprisonment. And in part two, we're now going to delve into the astonishing human impact on him and his family. So look, let's just start with the good news. The Supreme Court recently overturned the guilty verdict against you. Nonetheless, you'd been in prison for years. How did you feel when belatedly your long campaign to prove that the original judgment was wrong was vindicated?
A bit overwhelmed, to be honest. I mean, they asked me how I felt last year when I lost to the Court of Appeal again. And I said, well, the same as I've always felt, because I'm used to losing. But so why don't you ask me when I've won? And then I suddenly won. And you have all these ideas in your head about how you're going to feel, and euphoric, and it's amazing. And believe me, you do have some of those emotions, but largely it's just overwhelming, and it's just a sense of relief and exhaustion. Because, I mean, I've been in litigation with this thing, either here or in the United States, for 12 years now, since 2012, end of 2012, 13 years almost. And I just felt really, really tired. And I think I got told the day before on a Zoom call, and I just sort of slumped to the desk, and just I didn't even really have any words at that particular moment. And in your mind, I'd always been sitting in prison cells or sitting, waiting for the verdict, thinking that I would react in a certain way, but nothing quite prepares you for that moment. And in the same way, in a strange way, it's a little bit like when I got sent to prison, because nothing really prepared me for that either. It's almost like an out-of-body experience.
As somebody who was totally immersed in covering the financial crisis, it was striking to me how few of the individuals who were really responsible for the absolute catastrophe of the financial crisis ever faced criminal charges. I mean, this is not in any sense to denigrate your trading prowess, but nobody in their right minds would describe you as somehow responsible for the worst financial crisis in modern history. Why do you think you were singled out as one of the very few bankers to go to prison?
Our case became political. Basically, in 2011, the case was looked at by the Serious Fraud Office, and they concluded it wasn't criminal. Then George Osborne got involved in 2012. Gave blockbuster funding to the SFO. A new director of the SFO, David Green, came in, largely on the promise that he was going to prosecute LIbor. I mean, it was a very febrile atmosphere. The zeitgeist was terrible at the time for us as
Why
bankers.
did they single out LIbor rather than much of the other reckless behaviour that took place during the financial crisis?
They wanted bankers to go to prison, and I know Ireland did manage to prosecute a few people, but in reality, it's quite hard. I mean, sometimes you can have things go wrong, and it's like systemically they go wrong, and then you're trying to find like one person or two people or three people or however many people to blame for that systemic thing going wrong. And I think in the
we didn't really have a law of gross negligence then that could have been applied to some of the people who made the big decisions.
No, and that's why no one really got prosecuted, quote unquote, for the financial crisis. But there was this general thing, well, bankers are bad, and then the politicians jumped on the LIbor thing, really, in my mind, showing a massive amount of ignorance about what LIbor really was and how it was set. And I was sitting in 2012 listening to people in Parliament like Clive Efford MP saying that, what I did was akin to treason, that I was a crook of the First Order, that these people should be in prison. And
you were mentioned by name in Parliament, were you?
In select committee hearings, yeah, for sure. I'm not sure in Parliament itself, but yeah. I I also listened to lots of lies being told at various select committee hearings by various different parties. And and then the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, gave a Mansion House speech during my trial that was so inflammatory that we had to discuss in court about what we should say to the jury about what was being said. I mean, and he knew I was on trial. Everybody knew I was on trial. I mean, it was a very, that atmosphere was so politically charged. And I think I said in my press conference, there were people still sitting as MPs now who should be ashamed of what they did prior to me having a fair and unbiased and criminal trial where MPs haven't got involved and they shouldn't have been involved and they shouldn't have been talking about a subject matter about which they knew nothing, frankly, just to make political capital. George Osborne had a stock phrase: we're taking from the worst in society to give the best in society in relation to the bank fines, and he came back to that phrase again and again and again. I thought, mate, you don't even know what you're talking about. But we had to shut up. We were told by our lawyers to say nothing to anybody. So we let this false narrative start, and we never contradicted it. We never got our side of the story out, and this whole thing was just carried out on this false premise. And then, when the Court of Appeal realised that they'd got it wrong, they continued to perform legal gymnastics to uphold our convictions. And the ground that I won on at the Supreme Court, I ran that same ground with the Court of Appeal in 2015, 10 years ago, and they prevented me from going up to the Supreme Court. And if I'd gone to the Supreme Court 10 years ago, I wouldn't have spent 5.5 years in prison. I might have had a retrial, and I'm confident I could have won that retrial. But, the system's broken anyway.
Tell me about UBS. Did they stand by you?
No. One of the things that I think has really come out of this set of events for all of the traders is that what happens is when these things happen, they effectively have clean-up teams at these big third-party councils that's instructed by banks. And the clean-up team is basically brought in to sort of, minimise the number of fines, reduce the culpability at the head of the organisation, run the investigation. But the investigation is, in the words of the judge in America, that the investigation was outsourced to Deutsche Bank in that case. In my case, it was outsourced to UBS and therefore their third-party counsel. Andy Verity from the BBC quite aptly described it as asking a burglar to dust for their own fingerprints. They're a suspect in the case. And basically, they went round UBS as this first early mover cooperator, making proffers to every regulatory and prosecutorial body globally: Canada, USA, Japan, Australia, UK, wherever. And part of that deal-making process, if you like, was to give them some people to chuck in prison. And I was the person that I was the chief person that UBS could decide that they wanted to throw in prison. So
even though you'd made 300 million for them,
yeah.
They felt they had no loyalty to you.
Well, they had an internal investigation, where I wasn't even interviewed. Which, given that I was supposedly the chief protagonist, you'd think that someone would have spoken to me. But I don't want to hear what I've got to say, because all I'm going to say, well, my managers knew, his managers knew, his managers knew, and how have I done something that I shouldn't or I ought not to have done? I mean, UBS had their own internal IT system set up to optimise the setting of the rates commercially, and that was set up for dollars, euros, and sterling. But it wasn't set up for yen, which is why you have me sending an email saying, "Can you set it high or can you set it low?" And that was to a submitter who, in the main, really didn't like me and might occasionally pay some attention to me and might occasionally not. What UBS did in terms of the disclosure process, 12 million documents hidden in Switzerland that we couldn't get our hands on. And don't forget, the LIbor submitters at UBS sat in Switzerland. The whole thing was really scandalous, the way that bank behaved towards me.
Do you think there was a bit of them thinking, well, Tom Hayes made a ton of money and, caveat emptor?
Unfortunately, because I never got hold of my P&L for my trial, one of the things I wanted to show was I wanted to do a regression analysis, so have a look at what LIbor moved by every day and have a look at how much my P&L moved by. Yeah. Because if my P&L was solely reliant on where LIbor was fixing on a day-to-day basis, which it wasn't, it was part of it for sure, then you'd expect on days where LIbor didn't move, my P&L should be more or less zero. On days where it did move higher or lower by a large amount, I should have large P&L swings. Yeah. I wasn't able to do that analysis because UBS I never disclosed my daily profit and loss, and the court never asked for it to be disclosed because they said I didn't need it. But I would have imagined, knowing the book as I know my book, I probably, that correlation analysis would have given me some sort of, like, I don't know, 5% correlation. So for every 100 million I was earning, 5 million was maybe as a result of the LIbor fix moving a particular way on a particular day.
And what was the rest?
Well, that's just profit and loss from, one, making markets, and two, taking risk. So, I mean, obviously I'm sat there doing, I would say on average, I was probably doing 2 to 250 trades a day. I was making markets for the street. So, I would be providing the liquidity for them. So they'd want a two-way price, and, if you make enough two-way prices, you get people crossing your spread. The fair value is 100, someone pays you 105, then someone sells to you at 95, and, and rinse and repeat.
And just to be clear, this is all, so you obviously have, you're obviously numerate, you have a sort of, this is all your intellectual prowess, basically.
I could have gone and made that market for a different bank. That's why and my jury, I mean, this is why this allegations of avarice really annoy me, because in 2008, Goldman Sachs offered me $5 million as a golden hello to go and work for Goldman's, and I turned it down, and I stayed at UBS for half the amount of money. And I mean, but the problem is if you're talking to a jury and you say, well, I was offered $5 million, but I stayed for $2.5 million. For a jury, those sums are still like unimaginably large. It's like winning the lottery.
But so much of what you did then today would be essentially automated. But this was all you.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, I mean, I think more and more of it now is algorithmically automated. Some of it not so much, because it's some of the dates and the products were sort of over the counter and so relatively specific. So you couldn't really automate that in quite the same way.
Yeah.
But I've been out of the market for 15 years or 14 years, so I'm sure things have really changed quite significantly in that time period. Yeah.
And how did you get into it in the first place? What was your natural talent that got you in there?
Well, my overdraft got me in, actually, because I had an overdraft after the first year of university, and I worked like 80 hours a week behind a bar for like £2.70 an hour, and I came back with like £200 every week, and I just thought there's got to be an easier way to make some money, so I went and got an internship at UBS,
right.
and then so that was basically so then instead of earning £200 a week, I was earning £650 a week, and feeling quite good about myself, and so then it just sort of, that's how it happens. I think a lot of people end up.
Who spotted you obviously had natural talent. Who spotted that?
The thing is about talent in banking is you don't really get spotted. You get given a book, and you get given risk, and you get given the opportunity to make or lose money.
Right.
And then the spotting of the talent
but why would they take that risk on?
Because,
risk with you, as it were. Why would they give you a pot of money to trade rather than somebody else?
Well, I mean, that's what the recruitment process is at banks. It's funny you should say that, because I remember when I was going to Goldman's, I said to Wade-san, who ran Goldman's Japan, I said, you're giving me all this money to come here. I said, but what if I lose you money? And he said, you're my trade. He said, you go in and trade every day, but you're my trade. My trade is to pick the right people to try and make the money. And then I said, I'm not sure. I've coming here, it's like leaving your girlfriend. And he said, Tom, it's like leaving your girlfriend because you've met your future wife. And I still didn't move, but it's I mean, so you get given this opportunity,
yeah,
which is somebody's judgment call, but then you start small and it's very transparent. It's in terms of like spotting it, somebody's looking at your number every day. It's black or red.
Yeah,
it's big or small. So you'd have to be like a grade A moron not to be able to work out how well someone's doing by looking at that number each day.
And how did you get into yen?
It just got fortuitous, just got given yen. And then I moved to Tokyo because the Bank of Japan ended its zero interest rate policy in about 2005. So they had no short-dated rates. But I traded dollar short-dated and yen short-dated rates. And so then suddenly no one had traded any short-dated interest rates in Japan for like the best part of 15 years. Mm. And so I moved over to Tokyo in sort of early 06. And
were you effectively the market leader for a period?
In my part of the interest rate curve, so the very short dated stuff, yeah, I did a large, because I was basically making so many markets. When Lehman's went down, I think I was the only person on the street making two-way prices because the liquidity was just that bad.
Yeah.
I mean, other people might remember it differently, but yeah, that's what I did. And the problem was the better I became and the more money I became, the more arrogant I became, and probably I was not a good person. If I'm honest with you.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it changed me. Like you think that your successes are your successes, and you become arrogant and, well, rude, for want of a better word. And I look back at the way I was, and I look back at the way I am now, and the way this set of events has shaped me. And actually, I'm a very different person to the person who I was in 2010, and particularly in 2015 when I went to prison.
So was all that money and, in a sense, the adrenaline, was it of trading, was it corrupting?
I mean, there's a lot of alcoholism in the city. There's a lot of drug use in the city, because the thing is, you sort of like, you have to try and stay emotionally stable, because you euphoric highs, and you know, like, also very low, very deep lows. And so trying to stay emotionally stable when your P&L's swinging around like massively, particularly in really volatile markets, is a real challenge.
So how many hours non-stop are you doing this, as it were, trading?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you never turn off when you're trading, because I go home at, say, 7 p.m, New York's open. Or so when I went home in Tokyo, London was open, and then New York opened, and then I'll be getting a call at 3 a.m. because something had happened in New York. The non-farm payrolls, which is the employment numbers in the States, would be coming out at like 10 or 11 p.m. in Tokyo.
And you could trade from anywhere, could you?
Yeah, I had the permissions to trade from, and also I could call up the London office. I could ask them to do stuff for me. I mean, I remember going on holiday once, and the markets were really volatile. I went for dinner with my then wife, and literally the next day I asked if we'd gone for dinner together, because I couldn't remember it, because I'd just been like literally on my BlackBerry, because this was back in the day when Blackberries were a thing, looking at what the market was doing. And so, you never really turn off. The weekends were sort of a bit of that time where the market was shut, but you're still at the whim of global events. If there's an earthquake, or if there's, some sort of like event that's going to affect the way the market's open on Sunday night, you're still sat there thinking about it, worrying about it. And so the only time I really turned off, I suppose, was when you squared your book up towards the end of the calendar year, before the next calendar year started, and it was December, and you went away on holiday in December. The markets were shut, your book was sort of squarish, and then you could sort of think, okay, I don't have any active risk right now, I'm going on holiday. That's when you sort of turned off a bit.
I mean, you made good money, but when you look at it now, that period, does it feel like a nightmare, or does it? What do you think about it?
No, I loved it. I'm really gutted that I'm not still doing it.
Would you like to still be back in the market?
I'm not sure. I got asked that the other day. I'm not sure I'd be going back in for the right reasons now.
What does that mean? What do you mean, not the right reasons?
Well, I mean, why? So right now, if I was to go back, and I wouldn't want to work for another bank, so I mean, I'd go back, maybe work for a fund, the family office, whatever. There's those sort of options open to me. Am I doing it to make a point, to prove a point that I can do this, and this was like, like what happened to me was just ludicrous? Or am I doing it because I'm trying to find self-fulfillment? Or am I doing it, but what is the and this is what I haven't identified, what would be the reason, the really deep reason for me to do it? Because this process has changed me. And it's a funny thing, trading.
So tell us, how have you changed?
Well, I mean, I lost everything. I lost everything.
So you lost all your money?
Well, I mean, between the judge taking it off me,
So how much? So let's just say, by the time you're arrested, how much by that point did you made?
So I'm like personally, I was a 30-year-old, and I was probably, my net worth was probably over £4 million.
Right.
So I had enough money to sort of, if I'd wanted to live my rest of my life and do nothing, I could have done that.
Yeah.
But I had lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic, because I had this indictment in the States.
Yeah. And you had to pay for everything. No support from any bank.
Well, I mean, until none of the banks gave me anything, and then until they froze my assets, and then I had to go on legal aid. So I spent large amounts on private.
They froze your assets?
Yeah.
Well, because they said they were ill-gotten in some way, didn't they?
They can do that as part of proceeds of crime. I was the only trader who had his assets restrained, but that was all only done in response to me dropping out of the cooperation program.
Right.
And when that happened, they froze my assets. They froze my then wife's assets. They said she had a false name and a false address. Turned up at her law firm's office to serve her with restraint papers.
This is your wife?
My ex-wife, yeah. But again, that's just to put pressure on your family. In the end, it was all done in an ex parte hearing, and then the judge actually worked out that she didn't have a false name, she didn't have a false address, and she wasn't committing any.
She was a lawyer?
Yeah, a corporate lawyer at Sherman and Sterling at the time. Yeah, they turned up at their offices. They didn't. They could
That's
have.
so humiliating for her.
Well, that's what they were precisely why they were doing it. And then somebody, I know not who, reported her to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority to try and get her fired. But this is all part of a game where they try and put pressure on your family. My parents.
This was all about you wanting you to plead guilty.
Yeah. My parents, their house was raided at 7 a.m. by police who were supposedly looking for an absconded murderer who'd absconded in the early 90s.
What?
And I was thinking, you're the police. You know that if there's a matching name, it's not the same individual, because you can work that out really easy. My mum said, oh, it was terribly embarrassing. They were so embarrassed. I was thinking, yeah, because they've just gone to shake down a couple of elderly people. She said, we showed them our marriage certificate and then they were fine and they went on their way. I'm thinking, this is all public record. There's no way the police don't know that you are not an absconded murderer who's disappeared from prison in the early 90s. And I said, were they wearing stab vests, Mum? Because they were wearing stab vests when they came to arrest me. And she said, oh, no, they weren't wearing stab vests. I said, this is just ludicrous. I mean, but thankfully she was largely immune to the whole thing because she just thought it was some tragic mistake, which I guess was the better thing for her to have thought or believed. But nothing can compensate you for the time you've lost. Nothing can compensate you for the relationships you've lost. Nothing can compensate me for the time, 5.5 years of my son's life that I lost. You know, this whole episode has taken 13 years of my life. You know, you can't quantifiably put some sort of value on any of that. I think at one point, you know, I'd lost all my possessions. I'd got divorced, and you know, what was left, I'd left to my ex-wife, and I was starting completely again. And I had a wardrobe of clothes. You know, I had my phone and a laptop, and that was the sum of my material possessions. But you know what I had that was way more important than those things? I was free. I was reasonably healthy. I had family and friends who were fantastic, and I was just surrounded by every day. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't lost their liberty, but every day we are so blessed. So I went to St Ives on holiday with my son. Whilst I was on holiday with my friend, with my son in St Ives, we met up with a friend of mine who's been recently released from prison, and my friend did murder someone and did bury them in a wood, but you know, has been rehabilitated and was one of my best friends in prison. And we went out and we had a meal in St Ives overlooking the sea and the beach, and both he and I were just sat there talking about the absolute amazement we had that we could eat amazing foods, look out over a coast, you know, feel the sand under our feet, all the sorts of little things that I just previously always took for granted. Like now just going on a train journey and looking out the window and just thinking, isn't this fantastic? You know, there's so many amazing things that happen to us every day, and every day I can just thank the Lord and feel the blessings that I have for all those little amazing things, which previously, you know what, I never cared about and I never even noticed.
Tom, we're only part of the way through this story. We're going to continue it after the break. And when you were in prison, had you been in a prison in your life?
No, well, I got put in the segregation unit.
What's that?
Well, it's a unit which is primarily designed as punishment, basically because you're completely segregated. You don't see other prisoners.
But you're on your own.
Oh, you're on your own. You're not in the general.
So it's what people think of as the isolation unit.
It is the isolation unit. It's segregation. Yeah, you're segregated from the rest of the population, and that was for my own protection because I'd been like the first item on the news and this, that, and the other. One thing the prison service hates is publicity. So if you're not famous or infamous, I should say, they don't care if you get beaten up. But if you were like me, it could end up in the press, and they hate that. So that's why I was put in segregation, and I was in seg for like 2 weeks, and then I got transferred to a high security prison up in the Midlands.
Which was that one?
Loudham Grange. That was a BCAT, high security BCAT. Yeah, and so
what does that mean, BCAT?
The prison system allocates you according to your level of risk. So, you know,
risk to other prisoners, or
risk of escape, risk to other prisoners, severity of your crime. You know, and so they have categories: your high risk, medium risk, lower risk, and I was deemed to be high risk. So I was in prison I was sharing cells with guys who had like murdered people with Mac 10 machine guns. I spent quite a bit of time in the same prison as the Hatton Garden guys actually for a while. But I frequently had cellmates who were like who'd killed people.
Were you ever threatened?
Actually, funny enough, not till the very end when I was in the open prison, which is bizarre, isn't it? Really, which is obviously meant to be the safest of the safe places. The lower security prisons were more dangerous for me in a way because the high security prisons, you got guys doing 30 years, they're living in the prison. For a large part, they just ignore me. I meant nothing to them. But it's also like your safety in prison is not really a function of the staff, it's a function of other prisoners. So I remember getting to that high security prison after 2 weeks, and I went up to the office on the wing, and the guy sat me down, obviously realised that I knew nothing about prison. I was such an atypical prisoner. And so he called in this other guy who came, he was about 6'6", and he said, right, you, pointing at him, look after him, pointing at me. And I thought, why is this big guy going to be looking after me? But what he knew is that sort of guy was in charge, it sort of ran the wing, if you like. And he knew that if that guy said no one touches him, then I would be okay. And I was always okay because that guy had obviously just said to other people, don't touch him.
What happened in the open prison? You said you were threatened in the end.
Yeah, that was my cellmate. Yeah, I was throttled. But I mean, it was one of those things where he'd said something about my then wife before she told me she wanted to leave me. And it was only really then, I mean, I reacted in a way that I shouldn't, and I then said some very nasty things about him that I regret saying, and he reacted by trying to throttle me. But I just left it because, he was on a parole sentence. It could have meant that he'd stayed in prison for a couple more years, and so I just, it was the only time anyone physically laid a hand on me. I mean, I saw lots and lots of violence, so much so that it just sort of became normalised. When people died from suicides or drug overdoses, at the start I was shocked, but then by the end I was just like, oh, now I can't put my washing on. Why did they choose to do it today or whatever? The coroner now needs to come in. I mean, and you get some crazy. There's a guy below me who died from a spice overdose, which is a drug frequently taken in prison. And some of the junkies came out the next day and were like, oh, where do we get some of that stuff? It must be really strong. And I'm just like, that's just killed a man. Like, really, why do you want to take that? But that's the way I've seen people go into prison being completely clean of drugs and become completely addicted, and like it destroy them as characters because some people they haven't got the mental fortitude or strength to deal with prison, and so they resort to taking drugs.
And how did you stay sane?
My faith. I became a Christian in prison, and I used to be extremely angry, extremely bitter, and it was just eating me up inside, and I had to deal with that. And I remember I went to some prayer sessions because I just wanted to get off the wing, because the sounds and the smell and the atmosphere of a prison wing is something that only someone in prison can really understand. But going to the chapel was a bit of serenity, a bit of peace, a bit of normality. And some people from the Riverside Church in Derby, who I'd love to catch up with one day and thank them, would come in to do some prayer sessions. They're part of the prison fellowship. And they said to me, Tom, you've got to get rid of this anger. This is just killing you. It's just, you're so bitter about everything. And I wasn't a Christian at that stage. And so they asked me to write letters to all the people I was angry with. So like top of my list was the judge. And then there were various other people who I knew had lied at my trial. So I wrote the letters. I never sent them, but it was quite cathartic for me to write them. And then I came back the next week with the letters. And I read them the letters, and they said, right now, Tom, we're all going to pray for these people. And I was like, what? I'm going to say a prayer for these guys? But I was so, but at that process they took me through, it gave me real freedom. It was like the weight was lifted off my shoulders when I was able to say, I don't hate that person anymore. I don't want bad things to happen to that person anymore. I'm not going to be eaten up and bitter by what that person did to me anymore. It felt so amazing. And I saw a quote from Nelson Mandela that is like, anger's like drinking poison and thinking it's going to kill the other person. And actually I think that's so true, because I was just walking around in such rage all the time, and it really helped me. And then later on I became, faith found me, and I became a committed Christian. I still go to church every week, and I try to live my life as well as in the best way that I can. I'm not perfect by a long stretch of the imagination, but that's really God and the Lord and that faith that I found in prison got me through that very difficult period of time, really.
So what next for you? What are you going to do?
That, everyone's asked me that in the last week or two. It's actually the hardest question to answer, because for 12 years I've had to live my life on like this 24-hour basis where I can't really plan, because I'm facing a big criminal trial, or I'm in prison, or I'm running all these appeals and I'm on probation, and you just can't plan anything.
Yeah.
And so suddenly somebody says you're free, and the vista of freedom opens up before you with this panoply of choice, and you're sat there thinking, well, it's sort of paradoxical. Now I've got so much choice. What am I going to do? And the analogy I would use is, if you're given a menu with loads of your favourite dishes on it, and someone says, "What are you going to have to eat?" It's much harder to choose what you're going to have to eat when everything on there you really like. It's taking a little bit of time to get used to being free. It's taking a little bit of time to work out what I want to do. I'd like to go abroad, go on a holiday. I'm no longer on an Interpol red list, so I'm not an international.
Have you got a passport yet?
I've got a passport, yeah, but I'm not on. I was an international fugitive for a while, so they would have arrested me on this Interpol red list. So actually, I quite miss being able to tell people I'm an international fugitive, because that was quite cool.
Well, look, I'm relieved that you don't have to tell people that anymore, and I hope you'll pick the most delicious dish
on the
menu that you've got in front of you. Tom, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your story. That was absolutely compelling. And I don't say this to many people because I don't have to, given the nature of what they've been through, but good luck with the rest of your life. And that's it for this edition of The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston. Goodbye.